Now that the 2024 election is over, various changes have been happening at fast pace, from the different appointments President Donald Trump has been making to the different shakeups that are happening in Congress. One of those shakeups is a recent development that Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, removed Representative Michael Turner, Representative Ohio, from the House Intelligence Committee. This brings us to our question today. Is Representative Turner's removal from the House Intelligence Committee a sign of the things to come for the Republican Party? Now, we're going to address the answer to this question in a few ways. First, we're going to look at Representative Turner and the MAGA movement's beliefs. Then, we're going to look at the loyalty demanded by Republicans towards MAGA. Then lastly, we're going to look at Trump and his rhetoric on Ukraine. So, going into our first point today, we're going to look at Representative Turner and MAGA. We're going to touch on 2 points. One, Representative Turner's beliefs, and two, we're going to look and contrast this with the beliefs of MAGA. So, going into our first subpoint, Turner's beliefs. When we look at Turner's beliefs, according to the Washington Post in January 2025, Representative Turner was a Ukraine hawk and was very outspoken and a major supporter of Ukraine aid. Repeatedly, Michael Turner spoke and said that we need to put our full weight and might behind supporting Ukraine and being an ally towards Ukraine and not let Russia get the higher ground. This made certain people in the MAGA movement upset, as we can see that when you contrast this with MAGA. So when we look at MAGA, we can see a couple things. One, recently the Republicans just pulled Ukrainian aid during the Trump administration now, and this is according to The Independent in January of 2025. So we can see that Representative Turner's beliefs are not aligned with the MAGA movement right now. They are very anti-Ukraine in terms of funding and whatnot, but Turner was a major supporter of Ukrainian aid. So right now we already see this clash between pro-Ukraine and anti-Ukraine, and we can see that if someone is standing against the anti-Ukraine rhetoric, they're just getting booted and thrown out of Congress. In fact, Representative Dan Crenshaw, a committee member of the Intelligence Committee, told Axios, "We now all have concerns and questions about this removal and what this means for Ukraine going forward." So what we can see is people are now, because of this, we can see that the Republican Party is moving away from Ukraine and any aid given towards that. So now we can move on to our second point, which is Republicans demand MAGA loyalty. And we can see this in two different ways. The first being Trump's hiring process, and secondly, we can look at Mike Johnson and Trump. So looking at Trump's hiring process, well, according to the Associated Press in January of 2025, that Trump's team has a very rigorous hiring process, that they demand loyalty to the MAGA movement, and anyone who does not align with Trump's policies will be booted and not considered. Now, despite this not being Congress when Trump is picking these various people to fill his different appointments of the executive branch, we can still see, though, the personality of Trump and his team and how they demand people to be fully invested or get out of the way. So when we look at that, we can see that his hiring process, according to the Associated Press, they vetted social media, they vetted and asked questions about what their beliefs on the policies of the Trump agenda, and if they would support those at all costs, and whether or not they agree, if there's any beliefs they disagree. So essentially, if they disagree with Trump on anything, they're out. And while you might say this is not exactly the legislative branch as Representative Mike Turner is part of, we can see, though, how this affects us. Because we can go into our next subpoint, which is Mike Johnson and Trump. When we look at ABC in December of 2025, Mike Johnson and Donald Trump have a strong alliance, and Trump threw his back to support Mike Johnson, saying that Mike Johnson would get the Trump agenda done and that he would pass it and do whatever is necessary. So it looks to me like whatever is necessary means getting anyone out of committees if they do not support that Trump agenda and they are supporters of Ukraine. So when we look at that, we can now go on to our third point, which is the Trump and his anti-Ukraine rhetoric. And we're going to speak on this for two different ways. First, we're going to talk about how he has been siding with Russia in certain instances over Ukraine, and secondly, we're going to look at his promise to end the war. So first, according to NBC in January 2025, Trump even suggested Ukraine shouldn't have even fought back, saying aid for Ukraine is a waste of money and why are we spending all this taxpayer dollars on a war that should have never been fought in the first place. So we see immediately that Trump is already protesting Ukrainian aid, and as we saw earlier, he's throwing his weight around and wants to stop that aid. So then another thing we can look at is Trump's promise to end the war. Well, as reported by the Economic Times in January 2025, Trump originally promised to end the war in 24 hours between Ukraine and Russia. Well, this has not actually happened. So what we see is Trump at this point is doing whatever he can to help strengthen relationships with both to mend the war by pooling funding from Ukraine and making sure that there's people who are not dragging this endless war out by pushing aid that would keep this war going. So now, from these three reasons, we can now tie this all back together. So by looking at Representative Turner and his MAGA beliefs, we contrasted and saw that he was a very pro-Ukraine representative compared to the MAGA movement, which wanted to pool Ukraine aid. And then, so we can now see that people who are in Congress that support Ukraine and do not align themselves fully with the Trump agenda will be removed from these various committees. Then we can also look at the loyalty that Republicans demand, as Mike Johnson and Trump are tight and ensure that anyone who does not back both of them or if there's any wavering or doubts about their loyalty will be removed from the committees. And then we can also look at Trump and his anti-war rhetoric, anti-Ukraine rhetoric. And so for these three reasons, when we look at our question, is Representative Turner's removal from the House Intelligence Committee a sign of the things to come for the Republican Party? Yes, it is.